let me ask you a question. You are planning a trip with your siblings. Which scenario most likely describes you? In the first scenario, you have carefully booked your hotel rooms, you have made all the restaurant reservations, you've checked the oil in the car, and you've carefully planned out your rest stops. In the second scenario, perhaps you're in a rush in the morning, you're throwing all your stuff in a bag, you pack your food last minute, if you're the one driving, you hop in your car and you hope that there's a gas station on the way. And in the third scenario, you show up in the car because with nothing to contribute other than your sense of humor. Let me see a show of hands. How many of you relate most to the first scenario? Now, with the hands up, how many of you are the oldest in the family? Couple. How many of you relate most strongly to the second scenario? One. And then how many of you relate most strongly to the third scenario? Are you guys the babies? Is your birth order the babies? Yeah. Yeah. So I laughed as I read this because I remembered this trip that I planned, and it wasn't with my siblings, but I decided to do this 80-kilometer bushwalk in Australia called the Overland Track. And it's on par with what the Great West Coast Trail is in Canada. I was living in Australia at the time by myself, and I read about this in the travel book. I threw all my stuff in the pack, rented the stove, and set out on this 80K bushwalk with no objection other than I would kind of figure it out along the way. And what I figured out is that if you're going to walk 8 days through the bush and sleep in a tent, you should probably learn to set up your tent first. And then the other thing was that, it's easy to think of Australia being a really warm country, but when you're walking through the mountains in the marsh in ankle-deep water for 3 days, it gets quite cold. And the third thing was that I don't care what your birth order or your personality, 8 days in the bush is a long time. So I came up, it just made me laugh. And the truth is, only 23% of people will actually relate to their birth order. Because families are incredibly hard to measure. It depends on the gender of the children, the spacing of the children, the order, the socioeconomical status of the families, the blended. So whether birth order is more than pop psychology is kind of up to how we relate to the knowledge. But for my family, I have an older sister and a younger brother, and it fits us to a T. My older sister is the achiever. She earned her PhD by 28. For oldest children, the most common words, I'm going to pull out the description so I don't ad-lib and put my own in. Oldest children are natural leaders. They are ambitious, responsible, and protective. And part of this is because they are that way, and part of it is the way we parent our first children. Do you remember how carefully we watched them? And how we celebrated every milestone and thing and recorded it and the pictures? And then, so they learn to excel with achievement because we reward it as parents. By the time our second kids, the most common characteristics: cooperation, understanding, competitiveness, and different from the oldest sibling. That is the hallmark of a second kid. They don't have the status of the first, and they don't have the freedom of the third. So second children become the negotiators and the peacemakers in the family. And then when we get to third kids have to be funny, because otherwise they don't get any attention, right? You have to have something to fall back on because your parents are busy. And they're also comfortable in their parenting, so they're no longer interested in micromanaging what you do. And the studies kind of ended at 3, because I think after 3 kids, nobody studies anymore. So, nature, nurture, birth order, it's funny because I now have 3 kids. And I can see how my effect in parenting and how I change and grow also changes what dynamics we pull from our children. So, at the end of the day, I just hope that we all sort of enjoy the journey, we keep our kids alive, and we provide them what they need. Thank you.